Hello and welcome to the Actual Tech Media PanelCast. My name is Scott Becker. I'm from Actual Tech Media, and I'm excited to be your moderator for this special event on addressing key cloud decision points. Now, before we get to today's great content, we do have a few housekeeping items that will help you get the most out of today's event. First off, we want this to be an informative event for you, so we encourage any questions in the questions box in our webinar control panel. So not only will we have team members responding to questions during the live event, but we'll also have a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the presentation where we'll discuss in greater detail some of the top questions that have come in. And if your question fits into the discussion, we might break in with it right as it comes in. So keep those fingers limbered up and send in your questions. These panel casts are really all about free-ranging discussion and getting your questions considered. So that Q&A panel is also just the place to say hello, which a lot of you have been doing already. We love to hear where you're logging in from, and it's also the place to let us know if we can help in the unlikely event that you have any technical issues. A browser refresh will fix most issues, but if that doesn't work, just let us know in the Q&A, and we'll provide further technical assistance. As always, the handout section has a few valuable links in it. I'd especially like to call your attention to a link to get started with Rubric. There's a link to our Actual Tech Media Guerrilla Guide book club as well, where you can get access to ATM's great printed resources on technology topics. There's also a link to the ATM Event Center, which has our calendar of upcoming events, including upcoming panel casts and expert series and events like that. Now, at the end of this webinar event, we will be awarding a $250 Amazon gift card to one lucky registrant. Of course, you must be in attendance during the live event to qualify for the prize. Official terms and conditions of today's prize drawing can be found in the handout section. Just scroll to the bottom and you'll find the prize terms and conditions link there. Now, these PanelCast events are special discussion-based sessions looking at pressing technology problems with experts in the field. And today's session is about addressing key cloud decision points. So, if your organization is planning to expand their cloud infrastructure, you may quickly find yourself stymied by the opportunity overload and decision fatigue. You might be wondering, should your cloud implementation be public, private, hybrid, or spread over multiple clouds? Within a cloud, what type of cloud storage tier is appropriate? And what about the hundreds of individual cloud services offered by each major cloud provider? There's just a lot to think about. And here to discuss all that with us is Chris Wolf. So Chris is a solutions architect with Rubric. And while his specialization is in Microsoft SQL Server, Chris has a broad view of the cloud and cloud decision points. So we're in good shape for a good discussion. And of course, Chris has some special knowledge on the database side, so we'll get into that as well. But Chris, welcome to the PanelCast.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. So I said a little bit about you, but maybe you could just say a few words about about your background and sort of your day-to-day at Rubric.
Yeah, for sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Christopher Wolf. I'm a SQL Server Solutions Architect at Rubric. Before this, though, I was a DBA for the better part of 20 years in many different industries, having to do with online accounting and, TV presentation, things like that. So many different hats, as it were, over my time period. Currently, my day-to-day with Rubrik is mostly giving demos on how the Rubrik solution works for SQL Server. But occasionally I do fill in for our cloud gurus, as it were, and do some talk about cloud and mostly to do with like Azure SQL and Azure SQL Managed Instance and AWS RDS as well. So,
fantastic, great. Well, that's a good segue. Let's get into our first question there. So sort of as an introduction, just at a high level. In your view, what are the key cloud decision points?
yeah, so it all depends on what you're trying to accomplish with your systems. The last company I worked for was all in the cloud, but before then, we were in Rackspace. So Rackspace would have all of our key infrastructure and servers and things like that, including SQL Server, including our ADs and NAS and everything. But if we wanted to upgrade, that was a good 6 months process, and we'd have to, maybe buy a brand new SAN, and that would cost, a couple $1 million up front to get that going. So the company decided that in order to meet our priorities at the speed we wanted to, we would have to go to the cloud all in at that point. So we shifted everything from Rackspace to AWS, and basically at that point, we were trying to go as fast as possible. So whereas before, if I wanted to stand up a 5 node availability group cluster in a database, that would take me a good 6 months in Rackspace, where now I could do that in 30 minutes. So speed is definitely a thing that people look at when it comes to that kind of thing. But you're paying for it, as it were. So, those upfront costs, obviously, that's just what you pay, and we'd be paying Rackspace, or maybe if you're paying, your own server company to do whatever you need to do. But AWS, you're paying for it over time. Maybe you'll bring down the cost with reservations, things like that, but you're still paying. That's the thing. So.
Yeah, those are great considerations. And so one of the things that I was hoping to do here is just talk about three sort of scenarios that are sort of usual scenarios with the cloud, because everybody's spot in the cloud is different. And so the first one, this is probably a pretty rare scenario now that someone would have nothing in the cloud. Maybe they're in a highly regulated industry where they're just starting to have the options that are compliant for them to go into the cloud. But so for scenario one, what are sort of the key cloud decision points for a greenfield deployment? Somebody who is really just starting from zero in the cloud.
Yeah, so it all depends on what you've already got established. So if you're a big company that you've already got, all these servers and things like that, there's no reason to throw that out to the wayside. You could still utilize those things in a hybrid environment. To have maybe some stuff that goes a little faster in the cloud, but then maybe keep your regular databases, things like that, inside of your server systems. So it all depends on what you're
Yeah.
trying to accomplish and how fast you want to go, is what I would say on that part. So.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting too because one of the other scenarios for a greenfield deployment is an organization that is sort of small enough, and I don't know what the tier would be, but if you're a startup, you see this a lot with startups just going 100% cloud, not having any servers at
Mhm.
all, and so I guess that's another place where that occurs.
Yeah, and that's a good point. If you're just starting up, it's really easy to get that going. But what you'll find,
Yeah,
like about a year in, is that, hey, I've spent a lot of money on this. How do I make this, more cost optimal? And that's where you'll kick in to maybe a DevOps model, and you'll get some maybe some SREs or your engineers on it to say, okay, we've got all these specific things that run 24/7. Do we need them to run 24/7? Or can we maybe just move them to a different kind of scenario? So these are things that you learn as you grow up in the cloud, as it were. At first we were just spending money wildly at my last company, but then after a while we were like, okay, we need to maybe dial this back a little bit and what's actually necessary. So we started building
right.
automation to kill things if it was out there too long. And these are things you learn as you go along, basically. So.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's funny. I didn't think about it, or I wasn't looking at the questions there, but we had a question from Marty. Are the choices and
Mhm.
reasoning the same for a small, say less than 25 company as for a large company? So, Marty, hope we answered that question there sort of naturally in the discussion. But thanks for plugging that in there. So let's move to the second scenario, which is some of the key cloud considerations when you're not starting from scratch, which is where most people are when you're trying to optimize. Say sort of the scenario that you were just talking about, where you've sort of backed into the cloud, and you've got a lot of different departments doing different things in the cloud. How do you? What are the decision points there for starting to think about how to, just kill off some of those services like you were talking about, or or standardize. What's your take on that scenario?
So a lot of companies usually have their applications in a monolithic fashion where they have everything under one sun. And that's the way we were as well. But then we realized, to be able to utilize the cloud the way we'd like to, we had to break into microarchitectures. So basically, everything was its own application that interacted with each other in order to do what you were
Yeah.
looking for. So that was a lot easier to manage, and also, if you're doing the same thing with a bigger company, let's say that they've got on-prem servers, but then we want to do a little bit in the cloud, we could definitely break out part of the application and just have it be API calls between the two servers, maybe online and in the server and in the cloud, as it were. So just be able to connect to each other. That's some things we started looking at as we got more mature in our cloud journey, basically. So.
Gotcha. Great. Well, let's go on to the third scenario, third and final of these. Um, and so in this scenario, because of acquisition or sort of an executive decision, you're moving from one major platform to another, say Azure to AWS or the other way. What are some of the considerations there?
So terms from Azure to AWS sometimes translate and sometimes do not. So if
Hmm.
you have a shop that you've been in Azure and you've been in Azure for years, but you're coming brand new CEO and says AWS is cheaper, we're going to move everybody to AWS. So you've got to consider, do I have the skills in my engineering departments to be able to understand the differences between Azure and AWS?
Right.
Can we translate these services from like to like? Azure is very Windows focused. A lot of the Windows admins will understand Azure, pretty easily. But when we go to AWS, that's a lot of Linux and that's a lot of Python. And things like Go and the AWS interface. That's a big transition for them to make. They'd have to be trained up and skilled up to
Yeah.
understand the differences, basically. So those are some of the considerations you definitely want to look at, is like, do you have this, the people with the knowledge to be able to make that transition? So.
Yeah, that's such a great point about skills and your people. That's and people often underrate that when they're making that decision. So I'm really glad you brought that up.
Yeah, I learned
Um,
a ton about Linux when I went to AWS, so let's put it that way. So.
well, in there's another question from Bashir here that's kind of in the same area, and it's a great one for you because you've got this Microsoft SQL expertise, and so and sort of like the natural experience with Azure, but then you've also got a lot of time on keyboard with AWS. It sounds like. And Bashir is
Mhm.
wondering, what are the decision factors for going to AWS or Azure? I'm just wondering, like on a high level, are there sort of broad truisms about the one platform versus the other?
So consider, when I was talking about my last company, that we're talking like 6 years ago. And
Okay.
Azure at the time was definitely not as mature as AWS at that time. Um, Now the case is they're pretty much neck and neck.
Hmm.
The only major reason we went with AWS rather than Azure is Azure could not guarantee 5 nines of availability at the time. AWS could, and that was kind of our major consideration. Um, but when it comes to knowing the differences, it's kind of hard to determine what you're trying to determine what you need as far as a company. Do you have a ton of Linux guys who understand all the backends of EC2 and how it could be utilized better, things like that? Yeah, AWS is probably a better fit. But if you have a bunch of Windows admins, that's going to be a little harder sell, is what I would say on that part. So,
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks. Thanks, Bashir, for that question. So let's go on. Let's get into your wheelhouse. What are some of the key decision points when it comes to cloud databases?
so what we see a lot in my calls with the customers for potential customers with Rubrik, when they're trying to decide if they want to go to maybe Azure SQL or maybe use AWS RDS rather than have their own on-prem, or maybe putting it in an EC2 or Azure VM SQL Server install, their major thing is, can it do everything I'm looking for rather than, having a big gigantic DBA presence? Can it, take care of all the problems I need in the background? Um, Major killing points to that sometimes are they'll have a application from a third party vendor, and it needs to have a certain type of permissions because Azure SQL and AWS RDS, they obfuscate a lot of the permissions from you. You can't take native backups on certain points. You can't uh, pull certain things out of the database. You can't overtake the sysadmin that's already built into those kinds of systems. So, and that's by design because they're just trying to provide you with a database is all they're trying to do. So that way you don't have to worry about that database. It doesn't have to be something you have to touch, and it'll just run in the background. But you have to consider what you're trying to accomplish. Do I need SSIS? Do I need SSRS? Those are services, if you're not familiar, that basically run reporting services and ETL services. Are those things I need with my SQL Server? If you do need those, that's not going to work in those Azure SQL and those Azure and the AWS RDS world. They'd have to be a brand new install on an EC2 instance or an AWS or an Azure VM, basically, to be able to provide those services. So.
Gotcha. Um, one other thing I'm wondering about is, so when it comes to the cloud, there are a lot of different database types that are available. Um, I'm thinking of things like Hadoop, and I can quickly get out over my skis here in naming things that I don't understand. But
That's okay.
are there times when, with the cloud, it makes sense to consider something other than, maybe like an RMDBS that you've been using,
Mhm.
versus trying to do something that's more sort of cloud native?
Yeah, for sure. Database has become a wide term as of late, is what I would say. So there definitely RDBMS, like SQL servers, Postgres, Oracle. Those are still very relevant in the world today. But there's also data stores like NoSQL ones, like you're talking about Hadoop. Maybe also I want to do registry stuff in the background of my API, but I want very fast writes. That's better for those kinds of things. Sorry, I forget the term off the top of my head, but the AWS has a service to where they'll pull in all your API calls, and it's just unstructured data, but you definitely could get a lot faster writes than you can with a SQL Server or equivalent kind of servers. And it comes down to right tool for the right job. What are you trying to accomplish with the thing you're trying to do? If you're trying to do analysis, I'm going to argue every day under the sun that RDMS is still the best way to do that. If you're trying to do very fast reads, then definitely, those Hadoop or NoSQL databases are going to be way better for that kind of tool. And so it all depends on what you're trying to accomplish with what you're trying to
Yeah.
do. So, mhm.
Yeah, and I imagine, and thank you for using RDBMS correctly, since I put the M in the wrong place there. but,
That's okay.
But
It's my job.
when
So
when it comes to it sounds like you were talking about the people issues with with Azure and AWS before. How are the tools as far as some of those NoSQL databases? Are they easy to learn in an effective way? If you've got you know some sort of like people who are used to the RDBMS model, and they want to use something else. Are there a lot of sticking points where it's really dangerous for them to just try to quickly do that? When you need different people on the team, or is it becoming pretty user friendly, or at least administrator friendly in terms of setting up and structuring?
that's a great question because coming from Windows side, where I mostly did Windows admin stuff, it was harder for because we eventually got to the point where, hey, we're spending a lot of money on SQL Server. Let's try to changing everything into Postgres. And what we found on the Postgres side is there was tons of basically data about it, but no real community. Like SQL
Yeah,
Server and Oracle, they have a very
yeah,
big community. It's very, you could go on Twitter, ask for SQL help, and you'll get tons of information. You'll get tons of people replying back about what you do. You try that in Postgres, it's a little bit more like the old Linux guard who basically say, well, try it yourself. Like, well, it'd be nice if you just had at least point me in the right direction.
yeah.
So that was the major kind of sticking point was that it was harder to understand that stuff. As far as like tools and things like that, it's still very nascent in the background because it's a lot of people like to use CLI for everything. They don't usually touch a graphical user interface or anything like that. So there is
Right.
definitely a lot of CLI tooling in the background. But if you're trying to look for something like, SQL Server has SSMS or Azure Studio, which is very good for SQL Server, be able to connect to certain things. Um, there is that tool, but it's not very good, is what I would say. So it all depends on what you're trying to accomplish. If you're good with CLI, you like CLI, you'll be just fine in those
Okay.
kinds of worlds. But if you are more of a graphical person, then it might be a little bit of a challenge. So,
All right.
and
Great.
there are tons of other like third-party tools you can buy,
Yeah.
which will facilitate that as well. So, but
Okay.
you'd have to buy them where they're not free, basically. So.
Okay. And we have one more database question here from Jadeep, who says, for old-fashioned Transact SQL programmers, how hard is the move from on-prem to Azure SQL, as there seems to be differences in Azure SQL? And he goes on to say, I like this. I like that we won't have to do server management, et cetera, with Azure, but what about a
Mhm.
lot of non-Azure SQL code already existing, or the scripted solutions to go to Azure SQL from on-premises SQL code?
Yeah, that's a good point. The only thing to worry about is like stuff like C sharp built into your T-SQL code. Sometimes that may not work with Azure because it's trying to utilize drivers that don't exist in Azure SQL. So those are things you have to worry about. You just have to maybe recondition your code a little bit. But most basic T-SQL will work just fine. It's a SQL server in the back end. The thing to consider about like Azure SQL, it's SQL Server 6 months before the release happens, as it were. So SQL Server 2022 just came out. Azure SQL has had that same code for probably a good year on Azure SQL. It's the same thing. That's what they're doing now is they're having all the regular code tested in Azure SQL, and then they'll do yearly or maybe every other year release, which will bring that code to on-prem. So
All right, great. Jadeep, thanks for that question. Um, Yeah, so let's move on to security. So, what are some of the high level security questions to consider when you're making your cloud architecture decisions?
So I didn't get too deep into this because obviously we had a whole infrastructure security team at my
Yeah.
last company. But the major thing, I learned was key rotation was a big deal
Mhm.
and making sure. that, when you stand anything up at AWS, you are locked out of everything right out the gate. And they do that on purpose. They want to make sure that you're not able to access anything. You have to then go in and give specific permissions. What we learned eventually was that we wanted to give as least privileges as we could. So least privileges is an architecture that you'll hear a lot. Obviously at Rubrik we do zero trust. This was maybe minimal trust is what I would say. So we would create these roles. Let's say it was for a database. We would create a role for the database, and it was based on the application because each database was its own application. Like I said, we were trying to micro architecture everything out. So you'd give a role, and that role would be able to connect to the RDS or connect to the EC2 instance and be able to do certain things. And you'd put the developers in those roles, and they'd be able to go from there, as it were. So that's kind of what we were trying to do, was like keep it as minimal as possible. And occasionally somebody would come in and try to alter things and make it more open. But then we had a SecOps team that would come in and say, hey, no, we can't do that. Let's go ahead and dial those permissions back again. So those are things you may have to consider after a while. Like right out the gate, probably not so much, but just consider that there is a button in every instance you had that says make it wide open to the world, and it definitely makes it wide open. You could do whatever you'd like, but that'd be more for like dev and test environments is what I would tell you. So, but if you're doing production, you want to make it as minimal as possible. Like we had our SQL servers, they could only connect to the API, and that was it. We didn't want anybody in the SQL server specifically. Now, connecting to it through SSMS, things like that, that was fine. But as far as like the specific, application calls, only the API could do that. So,
Gotcha. Okay. So yeah, great advice in there. Key rotation, least privilege, some zero trust as well.
mhm.
Um, good things to consider. Okay. Well, um, and at this point, I'd like to get into some of the stuff where Rubrik is directly involved on a regular basis as well. And that's one of the reasons we're excited to have you on for this conversation, just because with the backup, you guys are touching all the clouds and all the on-prem, and really seeing the issues. So, what are some of the key decision points when it comes to backup in the cloud?
So with backup in the cloud, it becomes uh, minimal compared to the options you have on-prem, especially when it comes to things like RDS or Azure VMs or EC2 instances on AWS. We're usually taking snapshots of the instance level itself. And this just has to do with a limitation of the way AWS and Azure works, and that's for a good reason. They kind of want you to limit this to certain things because of the way they do their backups and the infrastructure in the background. Now, that doesn't mean I can't go if I install SQL Server on an Azure VM or an AWS EC2 instance. I can still take those same native backups that I've been doing on-prem. There's nothing wrong with that. We would then do that. Rubrik would then do it through what's called a cloud cluster. We would move it to your cloud rather than having hardware. We would have the hardware in an EC2 or an Azure VM or GCP as well, and be able to connect to that and push the backups to those through like an S3 bucket or Azure Blob Storage, those kinds of things. That's the kind of things we're doing in the background when it comes to backups and when it comes to those kinds of things, basically. So,
Okay. All right. Great. Um, so, what are some of the biggest mistakes that you see that people make with backing up to the cloud?
there are big assumptions I've seen that people are like, oh, well, AWS just backs it up for me, right?
Hmm.
And There is a little bit of that in the background. Whenever you stand up an EC2 instance or an RDS instance, things like that, um, it right out the gate, it has like a 7 day window it will do uh, inside of itself, basically. And it's
Okay.
just taking point in time snapshots for that 7 days, basically. And so you can recover from them. But if you want to go a little wider, so we were I don't want to give too much information about my last company, but it was an accounting company. So accounting, you need to keep records for 7 years. So when we started going to Postgres, we were using RDS to do so, and we were like, well, we can't do that. The limit for snapshots is 35 days. So we had to start orchestrating things through AWS Lambda to take snapshots periodically on our own. And so we take once a week full and just push that to an S3 blob, basically, S3 bucket, basically. And at that point, we could keep it longer term. Now that's a lot of work to maintain that. We had to like have this Lambda to be able to check to see if we had stuff, and then eventually clean it out. That's a lot of work. So it's good if you come to Rubrik, we do all that stuff for you. You don't that simplicity is the game when it comes to Rubrik. We will go ahead and take those snapshots for you. We set up what's called an SLA domain, and that SLA domain will be able to communicate with your infrastructure on AWS or Azure and say, okay, take a snapshot once a day. Okay, let's keep that for 7 years. And then after 7 years, we'll go ahead and retire it off as it works. So really easy to do that in the background. So
Interesting. Yeah. So is the SLA domain on the same platform, that the customer's using for the data, or is that somewhere else?
correct. It could
No.
be used for the same exact thing, or you could make brand new SLA domains, however you'd like to do it. So
Gotcha. All right. Super. And this next question, what are some best practices for backing up to the cloud, particularly from an architectural perspective? And I'll put a little shade on this, which is, I feel like a lot of backup, when people think about their backup, they're thinking about it in the same way that they've always done backup on premises, and sometimes not taking full advantage of all this sort of, you know, wild and imaginative stuff that they can do in the cloud. So just with sort of that frame, what are some of the best practices that you've seen or that you recommend?
yeah, like I was kind of relating to in the back slide, it basically comes down to like, are you trying to, keep point in time recovery for a longer term, or you just want to keep it for a certain amount of time? Most people I talk to when it comes to DBAs, they're not going to keep transaction logs longer than a week. They don't really care. If I were to try to roll back my main production database from like a week's time ago, that's millions of dollars that I've lost, basically, sometimes
Oh,
potentially in
right.
orders or for us, it was accounting notes. That's a lot of data to lose for all of our customers. So that's the main thing is like what are you trying to accomplish? So um, the main thing is like we could just use those snapshots to give us those point in times. Let's say maybe we want to extend it 35 days. That's fine. You can do that. But most likely, 1 week or 2 weeks is just fine for that kind of stuff. You have to consider how long do you want to retain your backups for? Where are you moving it to? Are we moving it cross accounts? Or are we just having it on the same account? Or are we having it different regions? Do you want to replicate that? Those are things you have to consider as far as how you want to be able to be versatile in the things you're trying to show, basically. So,
Okay. Excellent. A lot of good stuff to think about there.
mhm.
Um, and in the last question, in sort of this portion, before we go to some of the audience questions, but how does Rubrik help with some of these cloud decision points?
So like the transition thing that I was just talking about, if I wanted to move from one location to the other, that's a lot of work in AWS itself. You have to pop it to an S3 bucket. That S3 bucket has to be aware of multiple regions. And sometimes it is, it's fine, but then sometimes it's not. So then and then you have to move it out of the region to another one. What if I wanted to go to a different account? That's downloading it to a separate location and then moving it up to that new account. With Rubrik, we can help with that. We basically are able to move your data across accounts and move data across regions as well, especially when it comes to databases. With Azure SQL, I can stand up a brand new Azure SQL in a different region in a different account based on the backup I took from a different Azure SQL database. So that saves you a lot of time and headache in creating all those automation scripts that you have to do to be able to facilitate that kind of functionality. So
Yeah. All right. Excellent.
yeah.
So as we look into some of the other audience questions that we haven't addressed already, I'll just put a poll up here about additional information that people would like to see about the Rubrik solution. I'll just leave this up for a bit, but you can see there you can select a data sheet, technical white paper, customer case study, pricing details, etc., and click as many of those as you'd like. You don't have to just choose the most exciting one. There's lots of options there. So let's see. Jadeep came back to say thanks. I didn't know that Azure is just future SQL Server stuff. So, and he's also glad he doesn't like C#, so only pure SQL so far. Very informative. Thanks for following up
Okay.
there, Jadeep.
Yeah, I didn't care for C# either when I was using my T-SQL, but it is an option, so you can use it. So
Excellent. Let's see. Scott Page is wondering if there were some questions here about Azure versus AWS, and I think we've talked about that a bit. Scott Page is also wondering if you have any thoughts about some of the architectures, the cloud company architectures like IBM or Google Cloud. Any experience with those, or general thoughts about sort of where they are in terms of especially like on the backup side. What
yeah,
some of their base policies are, or anything to be aware of.
I don't have any experience with them. I know that we back up GCP, tertiary. Like we have like the whatever the VM for GCP is called. I'm sorry, I don't know it off the top of my head. But
Yeah.
that particular one, we do backups of that. But unfortunately, we don't do any backups of Google SQL or any of those other kinds of database engines at this point. It is something on a roadmap we are looking at this point. IBM, I've heard about a couple things. Uh, we don't have it, we're not supporting it currently in Rubrik, but it will be something they are looking at right now. I know that the big, what's the AS400 systems, that's what we have a lot of banking customers, and they're very interested in that kind of that kind of backup infrastructure for those kind of systems. I used
Oh,
to
interesting.
work for Western Union, and they were all at IBM Cloud because of the S400 systems. So
Gotcha.
it,
Yeah,
there's
I
tons of those
remember
out there. So
there are, and I remember when I started in IT journalism back in the late '90s. AS400s were already pretty old, and
mhm.
there were stories. We had a magazine focused on AS400s, and there were stories about people had an AS400 in a closet with, you know, uh, you know, bookshelves or something in front of the closet door, and they didn't even realize it was there. There was a cable in there. It was just, chugging away.
Yeah,
For 5 years, nobody had touched it. So those
yeah.
are, really robust systems that they hang around for a long time.
It's the whole reason the banking world still uses them. They're tough as nails. So.
Yeah. Get a question here from Brandon, who's wondering, how does Rubrik address the challenges of managing data across multiple cloud environments?
So that's a great question. Right now, we don't do that kind of setup inside of Rubrik itself, but we
Okay.
have a ton of automation APIs that can help with that. Anything you do inside of Rubrik is basically an API call to either a REST API or to GraphQL. And using those kinds of tools, you can utilize, maybe if I wanted to download a backup copy of SQL Server on an Azure VM and then maybe restore it to an AWS EC2 instance that had SQL Server installed on it, you could do that through the automation piece and also through the UI, that part as far as that goes. But there are other things like Azure SQL. What if I wanted to download that and move it to a different location? That's possible as well through the API solutions as well. So, and as well as like multiple resource at one time. Let's say you get a ransomware attack, it takes out your whole database infrastructure. You could do it through API and just be able to restore all those databases back. So,
Okay. All right. Super. Thanks. And thanks for the question. Next one here. Sachin is asking about just as the comment controls and risk governance. Any thoughts about things that you've seen with controls and risk governance as far as cloud, maybe pitfalls there, or maybe progress that we're seeing in terms of what's allowed in the cloud now versus what was.
so yeah, as far as like, I think you mean like federal information and stuff like that, like FedRAMP
Yeah.
is what you're trying to refer to there. Yeah, so FedRAMP is something we're working on. I think we're going to be certified here in September for it. But we also have, private versions of Rubric that you can install in some kind of government installation if that's something you need. Um, you know, to where it doesn't communicate to the cloud. It's its own thing. It's its own data center, as it were. Those are things we are currently working on. I can't talk to too much, but I'm not a government or a SLED employee. So, but if that's something you're interested in, definitely reach out to Rubrik, and we can definitely get the right people to answer your questions as far as that goes. So,
Okay. Super. And probably time for one more audience question here. We have one from Lynn. It's actually a pretty good sort of overview question. Lynn is wondering, what is your principle to decide the right cloud service model? Organizations must decide, between public, private, and hybrid cloud models. All offering varying levels of control, security, and flexibility. Any thoughts on that one?
how much do you want to work is what I would tell you. So, like, if you're just doing the regular, cloud, it will, the world's your oyster. You can automate everything you'd ever want to do, but do you have engineering team with the technical chops to do that? That's another question to consider. But, you know, if I go to private cloud, it's all on you. You have to worry about everything. You have to worry about the infrastructure. You have to worry about, things like that. You know, one thing to consider when you're going to the cloud, think about how much money you're having to spend if you have your own data center. First of all, you have to have a data center in a location. If you want to be redundant, you have to have two and at least 250 miles away from each other. uh, Second part is you have to have security to make sure nobody's entering the building unknown. That's already built into AWS and Azure. You have to worry about, hiring guys, to come in and, replace modules, things like that. That's not something that happens in Azure or AWS. AWS and Azure, they bring in literally a truck of servers on a flatbed, pull it in, and let things die as things go along. They don't even consider it a capital expense to have somebody come in and replace drives or modules. That's too expensive. So uh,
Hmm.
once that flatbed, all the servers are dead, they take it out, put a new flatbed in, basically. Do you have those kinds of connections with a trucking company to be able to do something like that? That there's a lot going on in the background of a cloud in deployment. So those are things you just have to consider when it comes to those kinds of things. If you're just trying to do something simple, the cloud is just great for that. There's nothing wrong with that. If you kind of get maybe a little bit more ornate, then that's where you have to make some tough decisions. Do I want to have some here on my own server, or do I want to have, some in the cloud? It all depends on what you're trying to accomplish. So
Yeah, that's a great point about those mega vendor clouds. They're spooky installations. They're so big and
mhm.
just so alien to to traditional data center structures. They're really interesting.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, the cooling alone is just nuts. The fact that they're pulling water out of the ocean and recycling it through their entire data center and then pushing it back out of the ocean. That's wild to me. So
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Well, that's a great closing point there. How much do you want to work and how much do you want to spend? It's a good way to think about
hmm
which cloud you want to go with. Chris, for anybody who wants to get started with Rubric, we do have the learn more about Rubric link, and we still have the poll up for additional information. But any tips on how to get started with Rubric?
yeah, just reach out to a sales engineer or a. We also have uh, engineers that will talk to you about your system and give you a good first intro and things like that. So, and if you need a certain type of specialty, I'm part of a whole specialty group. We have Oracle DBAs. I'm a SQL Server DBA. Me and one other guy are. We have cloud guys. We have security guys. We could definitely talk, down deep and dirty about what you need to be able to fix inside your systems, basically. So
Okay, super. Well, Chris, I think we're gonna have to leave it there. But thanks for being so generous with your time and for a really informative discussion. Really appreciate it.
yeah, I hope it helped. Let me know if you have any other questions. You can reach out anytime. So
All right, thanks a lot. And before we wrap up here, we have one more piece of business. It's the Amazon gift card prize drawing. And the winner of the $250 Amazon gift card today is Joe Ray Fathry from Texas. So congratulations to Joe Ray. We'll be in touch about getting you your card. And with that, on behalf of the Actual Tech Media team, I want to thank our sponsor, Rubric, for making this event possible. And thanks as always for attending and for all the great questions. Your questions really, make these events go. So that concludes today's event. Have a fantastic rest of your day.